morning of my wedding was a blur of satin and roses, a picturesque scene straight out of a bridal magazine. But as I stood in front of the mirror, clad in an elegant gown that hugged my frame, I felt like an actor playing a part in someone else's play. My name is Emily, a self-made entrepreneur with a passion for life's simple pleasures. Today, I was marrying Mark Harlington, a man whose world was as polished and refined as mine was straightforward and unadorned. Our story wasn't typical. We met by chance at a local cafe where I was nursing a latte and he was escaping the confines of his corporate life. He was charming, his Harvard education and successful banking career, a stark contrast to my own journey. I had built a modest but thriving business after high school, steering clear of the world of degrees and diplomas. The wedding venue was a grand affair, Mark's family sparing no expense. As I walked down the aisle, my heart raced, not with excitement, but with a creeping sense of dread. His family, a lineage of bankers and financiers, watched me with polite but distant smiles. Their world was one of legacy and tradition, and I was an outsider stepping into their sanctum. At the reception, the veneer of polite interest began to wear thin. I remember sitting at the head table, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. "So, Emily, tell us about your high school. That must have been quite an experience," Mark's mother, a regal woman with a hawkish gaze, inquired. Her tone was light, but the underlying condescension was palpable. I smiled, trying to keep my composure. It was a great learning environment. "I think it really prepared me well for running my own business," I replied, hoping my answer would suffice. "Oh, a businesswoman! How quaint," chimed in one of Mark's aunts, her eyes glinting with amusement. And here I thought Mark would marry someone from our alma mater. Mark, sitting beside me, gave a strained smile but said nothing. His silence was a void, growing larger and more oppressive with each passing moment. The evening wore on, a parade of toasts and congratulations, each one feeling more hollow than the last. I caught snippets of conversations, veiled references to my simpler background and unconventional path. I felt like an exhibit in their world, a curiosity to be examined and then dismissed. As the night drew to a close and the guests began to trickle out, Mark turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "You did great tonight, Emily. I know it's a lot to take in, but they'll warm up to you," he said, his voice a mix of reassurance and plea. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The truth was, I felt more alienated than ever. The Emily who entered that hall, hopeful and in love, felt like a distant memory. I was a stranger in this glittering world, a world where my worth was measured not by my achievements, but by the pedigree I lacked. As we left the venue, hand in hand, I looked up at the starry sky, wondering if my place was really alongside Mark in this new life, or if I had lost a part of myself in trying to fit into his. The wedding that was supposed to be mine felt like it belonged to everyone but me. After the wedding, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. I had expected married life to be a blend of love and compromise, but I soon found myself in a world where my opinions seemed to matter less and less. Mark and I moved into the house I had bought with the earnings from my business, a cozy 2-story home that was a testament to my hard work and independence. However, this sanctuary of mine was quickly invaded by the constant presence of Mark's mother, Mrs. Harlington. Mrs. Harlington, a matriarch with an air of aristocracy, began visiting us with alarming frequency. Each visit felt like an inspection, her hawkish eyes scanning every corner of my home, her lips often curled in a thinly veiled sneer. One evening, as Mark and I were finishing dinner, the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Harlington, unannounced as usual. "Emily, darling, I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice smooth like silk, but with an underlying edge. "Not at all, Mrs. Harlington. Please, come in," I replied, forcing a smile. She swept into the living room, settling herself on the sofa with an air of ownership. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd check in on you two. This place does have a quaint charm," she remarked, her gaze flitting around the room. Mark joined us, greeting his mother warmly. "We're just enjoying some quiet time, Mom," he said, his tone casual. Mrs. Harlington turned her attention to me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Emily, dear, have you considered enrolling in some evening classes? Education is so important, you know." I felt a familiar sting at her words. "I'm quite content with what I've achieved so far, Mrs. Harlington. My business is doing well, and I'm happy with where I am," I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. She chaffed softly, shaking her head. It's never too late to improve oneself, dear. Mark comes from a family of educated individuals. It's important to keep up, don't you think? Before I could reply, Mark intervened, his voice gentle yet firm. Mom, Emily's done really well for herself. Let's not dwell on this now. Mrs. Harlington smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Of course, dear. I only want what's best for both of you. The evening dragged on, with Mrs. Harlington's subtle jibes and Mark's attempts to deflect them. I felt like an outsider in my own home, my achievements and efforts dismissed with a wave of a hand. The visits became more frequent, each one chipping away at my sense of self. Mark, ever the peacemaker, tried to smooth things over, but his efforts felt hollow. The man who had promised to stand by me seemed more like a spectator, watching silently as the divide between his world and mine grew wider. One day, as I was tidying up after one of Mrs. Harlington's visits, Mark came up to me, his expression a mix of concern and helplessness. Emily, I know my mom can be a bit much, but she means well. She just wants us to be happy. I turned to him, frustration brimming in my voice. But what about what I want, Mark? What about my happiness? It feels like I'm losing a part of myself, trying to fit into this mold she's created for me. Mark reached out, his hand hesitating in the air before resting on my shoulder. We'll figure this out, Emily. We're in this together, remember? But as I looked into his eyes, I wasn't so sure anymore. We were together, yet worlds apart, caught in a web of expectations and pretenses. My home, once my pride and joy, had become a stage where I played a role scripted by someone else, and I was growing tired of performance. The Harlington family feast was an annual tradition, a grandiose gathering at their ancestral estate. This year, the invitation arrived addressed solely to Mark. Despite this, he insisted I accompany him, assuring me it was just an oversight. Reluctantly, I agreed, hoping that perhaps this time things would be different. As we drove up the winding driveway, lined with ancient oaks, the grandeur of the Harlington estate loomed before us. It was a symbol of their legacy, a testament to generations of wealth and influence. Stepping out of the car, I felt a knot in my stomach, a premonition of the evening ahead. The moment we entered, it was clear that my presence was neither expected nor welcomed. The air was thick with the scent of fine wine and gourmet cuisine, but it did nothing to ease the tension that gripped me. "Mark, darling, you're here!" exclaimed Mrs. Harlington, her voice echoing through the grand foyer. She approached us, her eyes flicking towards me with a frosty glint. "And Emily, surprised to see you!" Mark smiled, a hint of unease in his eyes. "Mom, you know Emily is part of the family now. I couldn't imagine coming without her." Mrs. Harlington's smile was tight, forced. "Of course, dear." As we mingled among the guests, the air of disapproval was palpable. Hushed whispers followed me, their words like barbs pricking at my confidence. Finally, we sat down to dinner, a lavish spread that could have graced the pages of any gourmet magazine. But the opulence of the setting did nothing to ease the discomfort of the company. I found myself seated at the far end of the table, isolated and conspicuous by my solitude. Mark was engaged in conversation with his relatives, his attention diverted. I tried to make small talk with the person next to me, but it was met with polite disinterest. Then, one of Mark's uncles, a portly man with a booming voice, turned to me. "So, Emily, Mark tells us you run a little shop. Must be a nice hobby to keep you busy," he said, his words dripping with condescension. I clenched my jaw, feeling a flush of anger. "It's actually a thriving business," I replied, my voice steady despite the rising turmoil within. "I've worked hard to build it from the ground up." There was a moment of awkward silence before he laughed, the sound grating and dismissive. "Well, we can't all be bankers, can we? Some of us have to do the simple tasks." The table erupted in laughter, a chorus of mockery that echoed in my ears. I looked to Mark, hoping for some semblance of support, but he was laughing along, his eyes avoiding mine. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any words. I excused myself, the walls of the dining room closing in on me. Outside, the cool night air was a balm to my frayed nerves. The laughter and chatter of the feast continued inside, a merry symphony to which I was the discordant note. As I stood alone under the starlit sky, the realization hit me like a physical blow. I was an outsider in this world, a misfit in their perfectly curated lives. My love for Mark, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a chain binding me to a life where I didn't belong. The feast of fools, indeed, and I was the fool who had believed I could ever be one of them. The night of the feast left a bitter taste in my soul. I lay awake in our bed, the echoes of their laughter and Mark's betrayal haunting the silence. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting a pale glow on the walls of our bedroom, walls that felt like they were closing in on me. It was in this suffocating quiet that I had my awakening. I realized then that I had been living in a fog, trying to blend into a world that would never accept me. My love for Mark had blinded me to the fact that in his family's eyes, I would always be the uneducated outsider, the misfit. "Emily, are you awake?" Mark's voice broke the silence, tinged with concern. I turned to face him, his features soft in the moonlight. "Yes, I'm awake," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry about tonight," he said, reaching out to me. "They can be harsh, but they don't mean it. You know that, right?" I pulled away, a chasm of realization widening between us. Do I, Mark? Because tonight, it felt like they meant every word. And what hurt the most was seeing you laugh along with them. Mark sighed, running his hands through his hair. "Emily, I didn't know what to do. They're my family." "And what am I?" I asked, the words heavy with unspoken pain. He didn't answer, and in his silence I found mine. I sat up, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room. "I've been trying so hard to fit into your world, Mark. But tonight, I realized that I don't belong there, and maybe I never will." Mark looked at me, his expression a mix of confusion and sadness. "What are you saying, Emily?" "I'm saying that I need to find where I belong, and it's not in a world where I'm constantly made to feel like I'm not enough. It's not with someone who can't stand up for me." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. I stood up, feeling a newfound strength coursing through me. For so long, I had let them define me, let them dictate my worth. But no more. I built a life for myself before you, Mark. I had a successful business, a home I was proud of. I did all that without a fancy degree or a family name. And I can do it again. Mark reached out, his voice tinged with desperation. "Emily, please, we can work through this. Don't let one bad night ruin what we have." I shook my head, a sad smile on my lips. "It's not just one bad night, Mark. It's every look, every word, every moment I felt less than in the eyes of your family, and every time you chose not to see it." I walked to the window, looking out at the night sky. It was vast and endless, filled with possibilities. I need to find my place in this world, Mark, and I need to do it on my own terms. As I stood there, a sense of clarity enveloped me. This was my awakening. The journey ahead would be mine alone, a path I would carve with the same determination that had brought me success before. I was not just Emily, Mark's wife. I was Emily, a woman of strength, resilience, and worth, and it was time for me to reclaim my story. In the days following my awakening, a plan began to take shape in my mind. It was born out of a need for closure, for asserting my worth in a world that had so casually dismissed it. I knew where to strike. The Harlington family's most prized asset, their bank. This wasn't just any bank. It was the pillar of their social standing, the source of their arrogance, and unbeknownst to them, the holder of my substantial fortune. I spent hours at my desk, poring over financial statements and investment portfolios. My business acumen, honed over years of navigating the markets, was my weapon. The Harlingtons, ensconced in their bubble of elitism, had no idea that the uneducated woman they mocked was a financial force in her own right. "Emily, you've been quiet lately. Is everything okay?" Mark's voice broke my concentration one evening as he peered over my shoulder. I minimized the documents on my screen and turned to face him. "Just busy with work, Mark." "You know how it is," I replied, my voice steady. He nodded, though his eyes lingered on the computer screen, a flicker of curiosity in his gaze. "If you need help, I'm here, you know." I smiled, a tinge of sadness in my heart. "Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it." After he left, I returned to my plan. I initiated a series of discreet financial maneuvers, transferring my funds out of the Harlington Bank. Each transaction was a calculated step, draining the lifeblood of their financial empire. I watched as my billions flowed out, leaving a void that would soon become apparent. Within days, the news broke. The Harlington Bank was facing a liquidity crisis. I watched from a distance as the empire that had looked down upon me began to crumble. Mark came home that night, his face ashen. "Emily, have you seen the news? The bank, my family's bank, it's in trouble." I looked up from my laptop, feigning surprise. "That's terrible, Mark." He sank into a chair, his eyes haunted. "They're saying it's a major withdrawal. A significant client pulled out their funds. It's catastrophic." I leaned back, my heart racing with a mix of triumph and regret. That's the risk of the business world, isn't it? One day you're on top, the next you could be at the bottom. Mark's gaze met mine, a trace of suspicion in his eyes. "Yeah, that's the world we live in," he said slowly. As the days passed, the Harlington Bank's troubles deepened. The family was in disarray, their composure shattered. Mark was torn, caught between his family's crisis and the dawning realization that his wife was not the person he thought she was. One evening, as we sat in silence, he finally spoke. "Emily, is there something you're not telling me? About the bank? About everything?" I met his gaze, my decision made. "Mark, I've always been honest with you about who I am, but maybe it's time I showed you just how much you underestimated me." With that, I laid bare my plan, revealing the extent of my financial prowess and how I had single-handedly orchestrated the downfall of the Harlington Bank. The revelation hung between us, a testament to my resolve and his family's underestimation. Mark was speechless, his world turned upside down. I had emerged from the shadows, no longer the meek outsider, but a formidable player in the game they had so carelessly invited me to. This was my retribution, my statement to the world that I, Emily, was a force to be reckoned with. The plan wasn't just about revenge. It was a declaration of my independence, a reclaiming of my dignity in the face of those who had sought to diminish it. The revelation of my involvement in the Harlington Bank's downfall created a chasm in our marriage that could not be bridged. The once warm and loving home Mark and I shared now felt like a cold, distant battleground. The air was heavy with unsaid words and unexpressed emotions. Mark was a mixture of awe, confusion, and betrayal. He couldn't reconcile the woman he married with the mastermind who had brought his family's bank to its knees. One evening, as we sat at opposite ends of the dining table, the silence was deafening. Finally, Mark broke it. "Emily, why? Why did you do it?" His voice was a mix of anger and pain. I looked at him, my resolve firm. "You saw how your family treated me, Mark. You heard the things they said. Yet you never stood up for me. I was nothing to them, and you let me be treated that way. But to destroy the bank, my family's legacy. Was it worth it?" He was struggling to understand, to find reason in what seemed to him an incomprehensible act. "It was never about the bank, Mark. It was about respect, about being seen as an equal. Your family never saw me for who I am. They never gave me a chance." Mark's face was a mask of conflict. "But this is not you, Emily. I married a kind, loving woman, not someone who would seek revenge like this." I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "Maybe you never really knew me, Mark. Maybe you only saw what you wanted to see." The decision to divorce was mutual but painful. The process was swift, facilitated by my financial independence and Mark's dawning realization that our paths had irrevocably diverged. As we sat in our lawyer's office, signing the papers that would dissolve our marriage, Mark looked up at me, his eyes searching for the woman he once knew. "Emily, I'm sorry. I wish things could have been different." I signed my name, the pen feeling heavy in my hand. "So do I, Mark. But we can't live on wishes. We have to face reality, and our reality is that we were never meant to be together." With the final signature, our marriage was officially over. I walked out of the lawyer's office feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. The chapter of my life with Mark was closed, and a new one was waiting to be written. The divorce granted me freedom and a significant portion of our shared assets, but it wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming my self-worth and closing a painful chapter of my life. As I drove away from the lawyer's office, the city skyline stretched before me, a canvas of endless possibilities. I had entered my marriage as Emily, the unassuming entrepreneur, and emerged as a woman who had faced her battles and emerged stronger. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was ready for whatever challenges it might bring. I had learned that sometimes, to find your true strength, you have to face the darkest parts of yourself and emerge from the other side, transformed and renewed. The finalization of my divorce from Mark was not just the end of a marriage, but the birth of a new Emily. I found myself at a crossroads, with the path behind me littered with the debris of a broken relationship and a family's scorn, and the road ahead open and uncharted. In the quiet aftermath, I took to spending my evenings at a quaint little cafe downtown, the same place where Mark and I first met. It was here, over cups of steaming coffee, that I began to pen down my thoughts, reflections on my journey, and aspirations for the future. One such evening, as I was lost in my musings, the cafe owner, a kind middle-aged man named Joe, approached me. "You've been coming here a lot lately, always writing. If you don't mind me asking, what are you working on?" I looked up, smiling at his genuine curiosity. "Just some personal reflections, Joe. It's been a transformative period for me." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Life has a way of throwing us curveballs. It's how we catch them that matters. His words resonated with me, echoing my own thoughts. That's true. I've learned a lot about myself recently, about my strength, my resilience. Joe poured himself a coffee and sat down across from me. "Sounds like you've been through quite the journey. Care to share?" I hesitated for a moment, but then began to tell him about my marriage, the struggles with Mark's family, and how it all led to me finding my true self. Joe listened intently, nodding empathetically as I recounted my tale. "You know, Emily," he said after I finished, "you've got quite the story there. Ever thought about sharing it with the world? You never know who might find inspiration in it." His suggestion struck a chord in me. Perhaps my experiences could indeed help others facing similar struggles. Maybe I will, Joe. Maybe it's time my story found a voice. In the days that followed, I began to transform my notes into a memoir. Writing became a therapeutic process, a way to make sense of the chaos of the past months and to find closure. As I wrote, I also focused on rebuilding my business, applying the lessons I had learned from my ordeal. My company, once a small venture, began to grow, expanding its reach and scope. I was not just surviving, I was thriving. One afternoon, while I was reviewing some business contracts, my phone rang. It was Mark. I hadn't heard from him since the day we signed our divorce papers. "Emily, hi. I hope I'm not intruding," he said, his voice hesitant. "Hello, Mark. It's fine. What can I do for you?" I heard about your business. It's doing really well. I always knew you were capable, but I guess I never fully appreciated it." I paused, taking in his words. "Thank you, Mark. It's been a lot of hard work, but it's paying off." There was a moment of silence before he spoke again. "I'm sorry, Emily, for everything. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." I sighed, a sense of peace settling over me. "I've moved on, Mark. What happened between us? It's in the past. I've learned a lot from it, and I'm grateful for the lessons." "That's good to hear. I truly wish you all the best, Emily. You deserve it." As I hung up the phone, I realized that I had indeed come a long way. I was no longer the woman who sought approval or validation from others. I was Emily, a woman who had faced adversity and come out stronger, a woman who had found her voice and her place in the world. Sitting back, I looked around my office, a space that was distinctly mine, filled with symbols of my achievements and my dreams. I had a new beginning, a chance to write my own story, one where I was the protagonist, strong,